Know when to start.
Okay, go for it.
Okay. Well, thank you everybody for attending. First off, I am Scott Brauer, a fourth year doctoral student in the developmental psychology PhD program. My research mentor is Selçuk, and today I'm going to be presenting a talk that I gave this summer in Lisbon, Portugal, at a conference focused on the International Society for the Study of Behavioral Development. And today's talk is focusing on acculturation profiles of immigrant origin youth living in Greece and understanding its links to academic adjustment over time. Um, so kind of a little bit of acknowledgements here. This project was funded by a research grant provided to our third author, our collaborator, Froso Modi Stefanidi. And this work would not have been possible without her in this grant, as well as the incredible support from the EPIC Lab, the lab which I work in. So thank you to everybody who made this project possible. And I'm excited to present this work. So a little bit of background. Acculturation is a field of study in the psychological sciences, and it refers to the psychological changes that immigrants undergo after migrating. Um, and theoretical models and empirical evidence have found that acculturation is linked to some very key outcomes, including mental health, education, and um, other types of outcomes. And many contemporary studies look at both how immigrants are building new connections to their host cultures, as well as retaining aspects of their own heritage cultures. And this is looked at both among people who have immigrated themselves, as well as generational differences across immigrants. And within contemporary studies, by far the most commonly used theoretical model is a study developed originally by John Barry, which is called the bidimensional or fourfold model, which is used to understand the acculturation process. So this model incorporates both the host culture involvement as well as the heritage culture maintenance aspects, and uh, creates four distinct categories based on whether immigrants are maintaining aspects of their heritage culture and building new connections to the host culture. So immigrants who do both would be categorized as undergoing or pursuing the integration strategy, whereas immigrants that build new connections to the host culture but don't maintain their heritage culture would be assimilating, which is where a lot of this literature was originally steeped. And this model is trying to understand the diverse ways that people are becoming involved. And as I said, this is by far the most utilized theory of acculturation. Um, but empirical evidence has not always found support for this model when we actually look at these in studies. Some studies have found that there are different numbers of acculturation orientations. And most of these studies are using what we call variable-based approaches, which look at things like um, dividing whether people are involved or not based on the mean value of the scale that's being used, or the median value, to say, based on the results of this variable, you either are or are not involved in your host or heritage country. And some studies have used what we call person-based approaches, which I'll explore later in this, and they have found some support, but others have found counter-evidence, again, different numbers of acculturation orientations. And key with this model is that the integration strategy is hypothesized to have the most optimal developmental outcomes. And this is called the integration hypothesis. And this is in accordance with the model itself, saying that building new connections and retaining aspects of your heritage culture is key. But again, empirical studies and reviews have found conflicting evidence. So there's a lot of counter evidence and discussion in the field about both the number of acculturation strategies and the integration hypothesis itself. And so this study is really trying to empirically investigate what's going on with acculturation among immigrant origin youth living in Greece. And this study uses a latent profile analysis approach. And I'll talk about that soon. And then the second aspect of this study is looking at how these different profiles might predict longitudinal academic outcomes and seeing how acculturation is related to academic adjustment over time. So this study is based on the Athena studies of resilient adaptation with 705 participants. 78% were second generation, so children of immigrants. And the participants range across a wide variety of ethnic backgrounds, but broadly categorized as Albanian, Pontic Greeks, which are people who have Greek heritage but are not living in Greece, and other ethnic backgrounds. And these students were sampled from 14 different schools and in total 57 different classrooms, which was important for us to incorporate. To look at acculturation, we had a bi-dimensional scale with 11 items for both the heritage culture maintenance and the host culture adaptation. And we also looked at generation status, which was a binary indicator, and gender as another binary indicator. And for our key outcomes, we looked at school engagement, behavioral engagement, classroom conduct, academic achievement, and absences, where the number of absences increasing is indicating a negatively valenced outcome, whereas the other outcomes, the higher numbers indicate more positive outcomes. And it's important to note that these measures were all teacher rated or were from school records, whereas the prior variables were all self-report items. So here we're seeing kind of some information about how others are perceiving immigrants and how immigrants are perceiving themselves. So we're seeing a lot of different perspectives coming into this. And this study is taking an approach called a latent profile analysis. Latent profile analysis is one of several person-based approaches, which is a data-driven empirical approach that investigates whether there are latent subgroups, so whether there are underlying patterns in a particular variable without having a theoretical foundation going into it. This is purely determined by the data itself. So this is an empirical investigation into how do we see acculturation. And so we looked at the acculturation profiles at wave one, and then we compared these profiles determined at wave one to our outcomes over time, over all three time points. The data set was imputed using SPSS because we had missing data, so we wanted to get as much out of this as possible. And as mentioned before, we had 57 different classrooms, so we accounted for this by conducting a complex mixture analysis using M+. All the analyses were conducted in that software. So let's talk about the results. The acculturation profiles, in general, we found a 4-profile solution fit the data the best. So kind of interpreting this table here, those first 3 columns, AIC, BIC, and ABIC, refer to statistics that we call information criteria. And the way to interpret that is that the lower values compared to other models indicate that that model is a better fit. So a latent profile analysis, how it's conducted is we first say, okay, M+, we want to understand acculturation profiles. So first, give us a sense of what the data looks like if we only have one group, if there are no subgroups of acculturation, and we get fit statistics, which are in all of these different columns. So the AIC, BIC, and ABIC by themselves don't have any meaning, but they're used to compare different models. Entropy VLMR and LMR. These two are p-values indicating significance of a likelihood ratio test, and entropy are all interpreted the same way. They look at how good of a fit is a model with this number of profiles compared to a model with one fewer. And so when we interpret the AIC, BIC, and ABIC, we look for lower values. Entropy, we look for values that are above 0.8, which indicates that this model is a good fit for the data. And these two model statistics, the VLMR and LMR, conducted likelihood ratio tests, saying how much of a better profile fit is a two profile model compared to a one profile model, for example. And if it's significant, then we should continue investigating until at some point it's no longer a good fit for the data. Now you can see here that we did find a non-significant result for the three profile solution, indicating that these two fit statistics revealed that a three profile solution may not be better than a two profile solution, but our other fit statistics were still showing that this was a good model. And so we did investigate to see what a four profile solution would look like, indicating that it would be better than a three profile solution. And we further went to a five profile solution, and this was definitely not a good profile fit for the data. So in general, we chose that the four profile solution was the best fit by taking into account all of these different fit statistics, which does support our theoretical model of acculturation using a purely data-driven approach. And so then we plotted what this data looked like, and we saw clear, distinct patterns in the profiles, which roughly corresponded to our four profiles of acculturation, which we labeled marginalization, assimilation, separation, and integration, where these left-hand items refer to the heritage culture orientation, and the right hand referring to the host culture orientation. And so then once we identified these four profiles at wave one, we wanted to see how these profiles differentially predicted our key academic outcomes over time. And so we had both intercept and slopes to say what were the baseline differences and how are they changing over time. And what's important to note on this table is that we get significant changes over time, that school engagement is decreasing for all four groups, but they are not decreasing at different rates. They are all decreasing at the same time. Whereas up here, we can see that, for example, the integration profile had a significantly different baseline level compared to the assimilation profile. Where the A's represent a difference between the assimilation profile and the B's represent a difference between that profile and integration. We wanted to explore both because the integration hypothesis was a key aspect for us to explore here. But prior literature has suggested that assimilation is particularly prominent among immigrant origin youth living in Greece because of how immigrants are perceived, and that people tend to really adopt more aspects of the host culture and not maintain their heritage culture because of potential discrimination or how others might perceive them. So we wanted to understand, what is assimilation looking like? Looking at conduct, we also see baseline differences, but very few changes over time, only in the assimilation profile. Looking at academic achievement, we have some baseline differences and all of them changing negatively over time, but not differently from each other. And we see a similar pattern with absences, again, higher numbers representing a worse outcome. So we see a very similar pattern in achievement and absences. And looking at these graphically, we can see very visually that there are distinct differences, that the assimilation profile is consistently having higher engagement compared to the other profiles here, with separation showing the worst outcome over time. And with conduct, we see something very different going on for the assimilation profile, with it decreasing, whereas the others are all increasing over time. GPA, we see no differences in the slope, the rate of change, but we do see, again, baseline differences, intercept differences. In absences, we see a very similar pattern. Um, Importantly, we also wanted to investigate how stable are these outcomes when we also take into account generation status and gender. So we also plotted the moderation effects between those. Oops, sorry. And looked at, for example, how does generation status paint a different picture? So the dashed lines are representing the second generation um, participants, and the solid lines representing the first generation participants, again separated by profile. Here, it's somewhat messy to see, but in general, we're seeing the second generation are having higher rates of engagement than first generation, except for the assimilation profile, which is still showing the highest outcomes. Conduct, we see some very distinct patterns where, for example, the assimilation profile, first gen is increasing, but second gen is decreasing over time. And we see very different patterns across the different profiles. For GPA, when we look at gender, we see clear differences between boys and girls being on this dashed line and boys being on the solid lines below, where girls are having, in general, higher academic achievement rates, but are not changing the rate of change over time. And when we look at absences, we see that girls are generally having fewer absences than boys. Again, the assimilation profile showing the most optimal outcome here. So what can we take away from this? This model or this study does support a bidimensional fourfold model using a purely data-driven person-based approach. But we find that actually the assimilation profile was associated with the most positive academic outcomes over time. There were some clear differences at baseline, but there were few differences between the profiles over time. Nonetheless, we see different patterns for some of the different outcomes, indicating that these profiles are not having uniform changes over time. And what's important to note, again, these outcomes were based on teacher ratings and administration records. And these really are reflecting how immigrants are being perceived in the Greek host culture. And we're seeing that immigrants who are assimilating are being rated as having the best outcomes over time. So we're not seeing youth's multicultural backgrounds being supported in this context. So thank you for listening, and I would appreciate any questions that you have, but that's all I have to present today.
Thank you so much, Scott. Really interesting work. Yeah, anybody with any questions, feel free to unmute or throw it in the chat if you're not comfortable, but I'll give you a bit for questions. No questions? Any comments?
It was crystal clear, I guess.
Okay, Ananya says, what inspired you to pursue this project?
That's a really excellent question. Thank you, Ananya. This project actually came about in a somewhat unexpected way. In my first year on campus, which was fall 2021, our department hosts colloquium series. Every single semester, we have a bunch of people come into the program in the department to share their research. And the collaborator for this project and the person whose grant this was awarded to, Froso Modi Stefanidi, participated via Zoom, and she started presenting some of her work on this project with some other analyses that they had conducted. And I was just really intrigued by their work. I had never heard of this project, and I think I had seen her name before, and I didn't realize that she was a big time scholar in the European acculturation field, especially. But at the time, I was super engaged with the presentation and the project. And I remember raising my hand and asking a question about their work. I'm like, have you looked at the underlying patterns of acculturation and empirically tested? Do we actually see this, or are we just validating a theory that we're just taking as our assumption of what's happening here? And she responded, no, we haven't done that. Maybe you should conduct this type of analysis. At that time, I was a first year student, just really nervous finding myself. I'm like, oh, okay, sure, absolutely. And I reached out to her and we ended up forming a collaboration together that's continued. This is now my fourth year, so it's been a 3-year ongoing collaboration. And this is really the culmination of all that work. And in addition to the academic outcomes that I presented today, we also looked at mental health outcomes, which is we're going to be combining into a manuscript in the Journal of Community Psychology sometime next year. So that's what inspired me to join this project. It kind of came about as we had further discussions and built this collaboration together. And it's been a really exciting and rewarding process.
That's awesome. Any other questions before we wrap up? Okay, great. And feel free to reach out to Scott if you come up with any other questions afterwards. But thank you everyone for listening and watching. And thank you so much, Scott, for presenting your work.
Of course. Thank you all so much for attending. Really appreciate your support.